Thank you, Natasha, and in particular, thank you for recording the oral recording of the session today. I have a new phone, and I was trying to find the voice recorder on my phone for precisely that reason, and I couldn't, so I'm very pleased to hear that you're doing it anyway. My pronouns are he, him. A couple of you have already come to thank me for the work that Good Law Project does, and the shoe is very much on the other foot. So through doing this work, I've learnt a great deal about how the world is constructed for people who are not white, cis, middle class, King's Council. It has enriched my understanding of how the world is, and so I am grateful to you. At least those of you who are trans. I'm very, very happy to take questions as I go through the session this morning. Please just raise your hand. I'd much rather that this was a conversation than a lecture. Good Law Project is probably now the biggest institution in the country advocating for the rights and dignities of trans people. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that people perceive the problem, or at least some people perceive the source of the targeting of the trans community or the answer to the targeting of the trans community as essentially legal in its character. And that's something of a misanalysis. It starts with, maybe you want to call it politics, maybe you want to call it cultural. It certainly doesn't start with the law. It's not a legal problem. And I'm not going to talk to you about what the causes of that are. As I say, I am a white male King's Counsel, and so obviously I have views, but I'm pretty sure I'm not the person in the room whose analysis of the causes of what's happening to trans people is going to be anything like the most acute. So I'm not going to talk to you about that. I do just want to make one very short point, though, which is that, and I suspect this is common to every community under enormous duress, we spend too much time, I think, asking ourselves what we are doing wrong. And I don't think that's the right question, and I don't think it's a productive question. There is no silver bullet somewhere in the chamber of the gun of one of the organisations that is going to fix a problem that ultimately stems from the enormous power and financial imbalance between those who, for whatever reason, want to make trans people a scapegoat and the trans community. There was a reason why more than $200 million was spent on anti-trans propaganda in the short US presidential election. And that reason is that money is effective, and that, I would say, is the real source of what ails or why this targeting is being so effective, and it has nothing to do with what any of us are doing wrong. No one is being too assertive in claiming their right to be treated with dignity. A phrase I use as a non-lawyer: there is no legal right to be treated with dignity, but that is a reasonable expectation we might all have. Now, I start with that point because what the law didn't damage, the law can't fix. The law sits downstream the source of the problems that Good Law Project is trying to tackle. Those problems, as I say, are not legal in nature, and so that which the law can do is going to be limited in response to those problems. The law can't fix them, but it can help. So the law is essentially a conservative force, conservative obviously with a small c, by which I suppose I mean that it lags behind where society generally is. And in the sort of good old end of history days, where we talked cheerfully about the arc of moral justice being long, but inevitably, bending towards, the quote that I'm massacring, that the law was a conservative force that lagged behind social progress was a bad thing. It was irritating that the law did not protect rights that collectively us progressives thought that it should. It's now quite a good thing that the law is a conservative force because the law now represents a really important protection against a generally hostile direction of travel. I'll talk briefly later about the For Some Women Scotland decision and what it means, and the answer put shortly is no one has the faintest idea. But the Equality Act is still a very, very important protection for trans people. The European Convention on Human Rights and its effects in the United Kingdom through the Human Rights Act is a very, very important protection from trans people, and we would all much rather be living in a world where we did not need to rely on those protections because society had our back, but in a world in which very often society doesn't. It is nice to have them. They are important. Now, what the law is in theory is a useful starting point. But what the law is in practice is a good, and I don't mean good in a moral sense, is a necessary qualification to what the law can do. The law in practice is not some weighing machine that delivers justice. The law is a human instrument and suffers from the same weaknesses that all human instruments suffer from. Judges are made of the same crooked timber as everyone else. There is nothing that happens when a lawyer becomes a judge that elevates them to some higher moral plane, some greater place of understanding. They remain the same people that they were, just with greater power. And the demographic of the judiciary is not a particularly trans-friendly demographic. We all know this, and you all know it better than I do, that age, privilege, being a cis male, being white, those are all pointers away from a nuanced, inclusive understanding of human dignity and justice. And those are qualities overrepresented, very heavily overrepresented in the judiciary. Judges are not looked at as a monolith. from a trans-friendly demographic, and that is reflected in the way in which they approach this thing that we like to think of, albeit wrongly, as a kind of a weighing machine, the judicial process. It's also very true to say that judges hate controversy, and if you're asking judges to protect trans people from a wrong, then essentially you're inviting them to reverse a thing that has happened that embroils them in controversy, and they don't like that. So they are resistant to acting both because it's not how they see the world, and because acting implies controversy which they don't like. So although the law ought to have a very important part to play in protecting the rights and dignities of trans people, the reality is that what it can accomplish is conditioned by those qualifications that I've given you. For some women, Scotland is an appalling decision, and I say that not as an activist. I say that as a King's Counsel. I say that as a lawyer, and I don't say that because it is solely my view. It is a surprisingly orthodox view amongst the very many boring, non-activist lawyers that Good Law Project instructs. It is really quite striking how angry much of the profession is about what the Supreme Court has done in that judgment. But it is a symptom, that judgment, of the factors that I've described, and I think in particular the demographic of the Supreme Court judges, all of those factors I described about, in particular, age and privilege. It's not a cause of any of these problems. So all of that is a lengthy qualification to the hopes that many have about the law being able to, in some sense, solve this issue. It will not be able to do as much as it should do, but it doesn't follow from that it can't do anything. It certainly can do some things. It's just quite difficult to predict what, because although it's very tempting to analyse the judiciary as a monolith, in fact the judiciary is composed of a number of individuals, all of whom have different approaches to these issues, and those different approaches make the outcome of cases very difficult to predict, at least until you know which judge you've got that is hearing your case, and then it becomes easier to predict. But by then, of course, you've already spent your money and made a song and dance, and the die is cast. I want to turn now to what, in particular, Good Law Project is doing. We have raised quite a lot of money, and we are accountable for the money that the community and its allies have given to us. Some of you may not know, may not have followed Good Law Project before, for some Women Scotland and that very successful fundraise. We're not a single issue organisation. So in our first iteration, 2017 to 2020, we fought and won a series of very important constitutional cases, mostly in Scotland, also in the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, around Brexit. Our second iteration was, I guess, primarily the pandemic and the cases and accompanying public campaigns that we ran around the corruption of the PPE pandemic procurement. So we brought the VIP lane to light, and we exposed many of its abuses. Since the pandemic finished, we've been sort of blundering around trying to find the next thing that we ought to focus on. And when the For Some Women Scotland decision emerged, we were already moving towards a focus on trying to resist encroaching authoritarianism. So trying to draw some lines in the sand, trying to defend those lines in the sand. So this afternoon, I'm speaking to a Silk at Matrix Chambers about what we understand is going to happen in Parliament next week, to Palestine Action in consequence of it spray painting a couple of aeroplanes. It's going to be, we understand it, prescribed, and should Palestine Action want us to, we will put together a legal team to try and stop that happening. We were moving towards trying to resist the encroachment of authoritarianism, drawing some lines in the sand, being a beacon of hope, because I got one day an email from a friend who told me of a tragedy that had befallen one of her friends, a family with a trans child. I'm not going to go into exactly what that tragedy was, but this was at a point in time when we weren't actually doing trans work, and I thought to myself, why is she reaching out to me at a point in time when we're not doing this work? And I realised that there was no one else really to whom she could reach out to, and I thought that if by trying to stand up, maybe we're Canute, not really for me to say, and resist encroaching authoritarianism, maybe by giving people some hope, that in itself is a useful function. So we were already moving there when the For Some Women Scotland decision emerged. And of course, if you're about resisting authoritarianism, if you're about trying to defend some lines in the sand, sorry to say to everyone in the room who is trans, trans rights are where the action is, right? That is the sharp edge of authoritarianism in the United Kingdom, and not just in the United Kingdom. We're funded by members of the public, so we're very, very independent. We have about 30,000 people who give us money every single month in direct debits. We also have a lot of people who give us money every month in one-off donations as well. So we have an income of about 5 million quid per annum, perhaps a little bit more than that, of which about 90% is from kind of regular retail donors. I think today about 12 or 13% of that 5 million quid comes from people giving us more than £10,000 a year. That's probably as high as it's ever been. A year ago it would have been 6 or 7%. And we've been working with one break for trans rights since about 2020. So we brought a judicial review challenging the very lengthy delays in trans healthcare for young people, back when there was trans healthcare for young people, albeit very delayed. We then arranged an intervention after the shocking divisional court decision in the Keira Bell case. We put together a legal team, we funded the legal team, we put together a group of interveners, and that intervention succeeded in the Court of Appeal. We ran a case called AB, a very significant case, although not much known about, in which after Bell, the Tavistock refused to accept the consent of a child to gender affirming care as being sufficient. and regarded the consent of parents as irrelevant. And so we brought a case on behalf of a child and their parents who both consented to gender-affirming healthcare, and we said to the court, the doctor wants to treat, the child wants to be treated, the parents want the child to be treated. There is no space now for anybody else to have a say in this. You, the judge, are in no position. You have no basis upon which to interfere with that triumvirate of views. And we were before Natalie Leven, who certainly then was quite trans-hostile. You can see that in her judgment. She wrote, this is my understanding, the decision of the divisional court in Bell, and she was, if you read the judgment, you get the impression that she was sort of forced to accept that proposition. We've also lost cases as well. So we brought the challenge to the emergency regs that created the most hostile regime to gender-affirming care for young people in the notionally developed world, the puberty blockers challenge. We arranged the intervention in the For Some Women Scotland case of Victoria MacLeod and Professor Stephen Whittle, an intervention the Supreme Court staggeringly refused to hear from. And whilst I've been chatting to you, I keep seeing messages from Victoria, WhatsApp messages flashing up on my phone, which I'm trying not to read as I speak. This is not easy work to do, and it's not cheap work to do either. We spent about £30,000 in council's fees. There were solicitors' costs on top of that, and the costs of running that that attempt at an intervention. So all of those costs in relation to an intervention that the Supreme Court did not even accept. So it's very expensive. We've spent enormously more over the years than we've raised. It's also really, really hard work in non-financial terms. Forgive me, I'm going to stand here and tell you something that most of you know and know better than I know it, and I'm going to tell it to you anyway. One of the ways in which the press undermines the rights and the dignity and the humanity of trans people is by othering them. So all of those images on Parliament Square in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision of trans joy or protest, read to a rather baffled cis readership or audience as people that they did not know or recognise, a constituency of people not like them, whose hopes, whose expectations, whose humanity they could not identify with. And as we all know, once you are able to dehumanize somebody, it becomes much easier to treat them badly. And one of the odd things about having someone like me do this work is that because I'm very, very dull, I'm like married happily for 20 years, I've got 3 kids, I'm a silk, I sound like I do, I look like I do. I've said it already, I'm not going to say it again. It's just quite difficult to other me. So people who ought to listen to you but don't, they listen to me. And that makes me quite a powerful advocate, and that power makes me something of a threat. And so I get lots and lots of attacks in the mainstream press and the BBC. And that requires a lot of management, right? The most difficult bit of my job actually is tackling what happens between my ears. Of course, the longer you manage to do this, the better you become at tackling that. This is not a kind of an agony Olympics, right? I can also put down my activism and walk down the street, and nobody's going to say, "Oh, you're a trans activist, are you?" This is not an agony Olympics. I'm just saying that the work is hard. So I've talked briefly about the For Some Women Scotland decision. That's my wife's joke, by the way. She used to talk about the Centre for Women's Justice, and she would always call it the Centre for Some Women's Justice. I quite like the joke, so I now use it in all sorts of other settings. I talked about it being baffling and offensive to a surprising constituency in the legal community, a constituency of liberal lawyers, those who sweetly regard the law as being neutral, who sweetly regard the law as being essentially a weighing machine. I don't use the word liberal in that sense in a pejorative term. I'm just trying to describe how they think about what the law is and what the law does. And I talked about it being a symptom of where society, at least in the United Kingdom, has found itself rather than a cause. But I think it has changed quite a lot in ways that actually are quite helpful. The fact that lawyers are now alert to something bad happening in the law is quite helpful, and I am now more optimistic than I have been hitherto about what the law might be able to do, because I think there is going to be something of a pushback in the lower courts, and I imagine quite a few of the judges in the Supreme Court will be thinking, fuck, we really didn't get that right, did we? They will be. And indeed, a different Supreme Court may well have decided the case differently even then. So the legal community is interested in a way that it hasn't been interested previously. The cruelty has become much more evident. And I am very optimistic, actually, about the people of Great Britain. We want to be kind. We want to treat people with dignity, with fairness. We don't like the targeting of individuals. And I think we can see quite a lot of cruelty increasingly, and I don't think we like it. I was chatting to somebody the other day who was asking what I did, and I said, I run Good Law Project, and she said, what's that? And I said, oh, well, we do legal activism, doing quite lots for the trans community at the moment. And she smiled and she said, my auntie's got one of those. And I was quite cheered by that, actually, because although the language was obviously not the language I would use, there was a kind of decency and humanity, a desire, because there was somebody trans in her broader family circle, to see that, as she would put it, as a human being entitled to the same respect as every other. So the cruelty is becoming more evident, and we don't like it. The increasing visibility of trans people in our lives is enabling us to counter the othering that I described earlier. Some new funders are emerging. So I mentioned that our funding was now about 86 or 87% from members of the public rather than 94, which should have been a year ago, and that's because some bigger funders who want to support trans rights, either because there is someone trans in their family and they recognise that they can't ignore the issue any longer, or because they recognise that trans rights is the kind of avant-garde of authoritarianism. Those funders are coming forward. They recognise this is no longer a thing that they can ignore. But it is a political or a cultural problem, not a legal one, as I said. So our headline strategy is essentially a strategy that meets that analysis. What we want to do is confront the government with a choice between pandering to the transphobes and having the United Kingdom declared in breach of its Strasbourg law obligations. Because I think that it will be very, very difficult for a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party to be seen to be abandoning its commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. It will no longer be able to cosplay to a liberal constituency as being a liberal or progressive political party if it is breaching its Strasbourg obligations to a targeted minoritized group. And I think that will shift the political dial. And if you think the problem is a political problem, then you really do need to shift the political dial. So that's our headline strategy. It's to confront Labour with a political choice. But in the meantime, there is a lot of work on the ground to do. So I was contacted a couple of days ago by a woman whose employer had told her that she now needed to use the wrong toilets, the men's toilets, and she went home and she tried to take her own life. And you know from the way in which I've told you the story that thankfully she didn't succeed. But there's quite a lot to be done trying to prevent, doing what little we can to prevent future recurrences of incidents like that, because although she was lucky, God, I've got 2 minutes, others will not be. So we have about 40 odd cases that we're working on at the moment, and let me just sort of break them into clusters. We have this strategy of tackling the various J.K. Rowling proxy orgs, which are involved in trying to force a false narrative into the world about what For Some Women Scotland does. There is a heading in that judgment. It's parentheses 20, and then the heading says something like why this judgment does not have any negative impact on trans people with or without a GRC. The Supreme Court says that the decision does not have any deleterious effect on trans people, and it says that explicitly and in terms. You never read that in any mainstream coverage of the judgment, but that is what the Supreme Court says. And what the EHRC, so-called, and the J.K. Rowling proxies have done is try to create this false narrative about what the judgment does. And we are trying to push back so that employers, in particular, service providers more generally, don't overreach and cause harm to the community. We're trying to create some counter-peril, if you like, for those who are reliant on the EHRC interim statement, ignoring the legal protections that the law still gives to trans people. We've got a suite of those cases. We've got a suite of sports cases. So cricket, football, darts, pool, all of those sports we are actively involved in. We've got a suite of data rights cases. So one of the really interesting things about UK GDPR is that it stems from EU GDPR. EU GDPR, I think in Article 5, says that data controllers have to hold accurate data. And for almost all data controllers, accurate data for somebody who is trans is data that records their real sex, not the sex that was assigned to them at birth. And so there's a fun case to be brought, suing a data controller who holds inaccurate data about a trans person, who holds data that their true sex is the sex that was assigned to them at birth. We will say that data is inaccurate. You need to hold the accurate data, which is their real sex. There's a whole bunch of cases that we're looking at. Some we are bringing already about the harassment of trans people in the courts and in social media. We're looking at a series of free speech cases, so we're very, very interested in the Office for Students. It's amazing how many of these organisations bear titles that reflect the polar opposite of what they actually do. It really ought to be the Office Against Students. This is the University of Sussex Kathleen Stock thing. And there's also a series of cases about that political strategy. And we're also funding a series of cultural events. So there is a major concert with A-listers, like genuine A-listers, that I am about 80% sure will happen around Trans Day of Visibility next year. We are talking to a very prestigious TV production company about the work that we're doing post for Some Women in Scotland, and there will be probably 60% likely some programs around that. And there are a couple of other events. I'm being a bit vague because I don't want to tell you too much about them until I know that they're going to happen, which we're bankrolling. And we're also supporting some trans-led work as well. So some of you will know about this documentary maker who writes letters to politicians, and the thing that they've just made is Dear Where's Part 1 and Part 2, and Part 2 is being shown in a cinema in Hackney, I think on Thursday. We're paying for a cinema screening on Tuesday. And we're also funding We Are Queer AF. This may be the one academic audience that I don't need to explain what the AF stands for. I mean, I've got like 5 minutes more, but that's probably a natural place to break, and Natasha is nodding off the stage with you, Maugham, so I will. Thank you very, very much.